The war is nearing its end, but for those still trapped inside its aftermath, time has lost all generosity. Victory exists somewhere beyond the horizon, spoken of in distant voices and radio transmissions, yet it has not reached the ground where hunger still governs the body and fear still governs the mind. The woman moves through this world as if already erased, her physical presence reduced by months of deprivation, her inner life narrowed to calculation and restraint. Starvation has not only hollowed her body, it has reordered her understanding of reality. Every decision is filtered through exhaustion. Every movement costs something she no longer has. Her shame is inseparable from her hunger. It does not originate from a single act or belief, but from prolonged exposure to powerlessness. To be hungry in this moment is to feel accused by circumstance itself, as if need were a moral failing rather than the predictable result of war. She avoids mirrors, not because she fears her reflection, but because it confirms what she already knows, that she has been reduced to something fragile and visible in a world that punishes weakness. The body becomes evidence, and she carries it with quiet resentment toward herself. Around her, the landscape offers no refuge. Buildings stand half open, their interiors exposed like wounds that never closed. Streets once designed for commerce and conversation now funnel people into silence, each individual absorbed in private arithmetic of survival. There is no spectacle to her suffering, no dramatic collapse, only the slow erosion of strength. This makes her pain feel illegitimate, as though only loud suffering deserves acknowledgement. The absence of witnesses deepens her sense of isolation. She has learned, through repetition, that hunger sharpens not only the body but the mind's capacity for fear. Rumors circulate faster than relief. Stories of reprisals, detentions, and reckoning move through the population with an authority that no official announcement can rival. She does not know which stories are true, but she has learned that believing the worst is a form of protection. Expecting cruelty reduces the shock when it arrives. Hope, by contrast, feels dangerous, like a luxury that could cost her what little control she retains. Her identity has become a liability. Once, it may have offered belonging or structure, but now it feels like a mark she cannot erase. She carries it silently, aware that the war has rearranged moral categories with brutal efficiency. Innocence is no longer assumed, it must be proven, and proof is rarely sufficient. She has internalized this logic so deeply that she no longer questions it. The idea that she might deserve help feels irrational, almost arrogant. Each day unfolds with the same restrained discipline. She rises when her body allows it, conserving energy with deliberate stillness. Movement is calculated, speech minimized. She has learned that attention is costly, that to be noticed is to invite scrutiny. Even hunger is endured quietly, without complaint, because complaint implies expectation. And expectation, she believes, leads only to disappointment or punishment. There are moments when instinct threatens to override caution. The body sends signals that are impossible to ignore. Dizziness, trembling, the dull ache that spreads from the stomach into the limbs. In those moments, survival urges her toward action, toward risk. But fear intervenes just as forcefully, reminding her of what action might provoke. She exists in this tension, suspended between biological necessity and psychological conditioning, unable to fully satisfy either. The war has taught her that morality is not distributed evenly. Some suffer loudly and are remembered. Others fade quietly and leave no record. She assumes she belongs to the latter category. Her suffering feels small in comparison to the vast destruction around her, and this comparison further erodes her sense of worth. She tells herself that endurance is all that is required of her, that asking for more would be an indulgence. She remembers a time when food was ordinary, when hunger was temporary and solvable. These memories surface without comfort, serving instead as reminders of distance. The past feels like a different life assigned to someone else. To dwell on it risks awakening grief she cannot afford to feel. So she suppresses memory as carefully as she suppresses need. The presence of authority figures, uniforms, accents, organized movement, elicits an immediate physical response. Her muscles tighten, her breathing shallow. Even before thought intervenes, her body prepares for danger. This reaction has become automatic, the result of repeated exposure to unpredictability. Authority no longer represents order, it represents power untempered by understanding. She does not imagine herself as a victim. That word implies recognition, and recognition implies response. Instead, she sees herself as an outcome, the logical consequence of events too large to resist. This framing offers a grim kind of stability. If her condition is inevitable, then resistance is unnecessary. She focuses on persistence rather than protest. As the days pass, starvation begins to distort perception. Time stretches unevenly. Sounds feel sharper, silence is heavier. The boundary between thought and sensation blurs. Shame becomes less articulate but more pervasive, a background presence that colors every interaction. Even when alone, she feels observed by an invisible standard she cannot meet. She anticipates the future only in abstract terms. Survival extends no further than the next day, sometimes the next hour. She has learned not to imagine outcomes that depend on kindness. Kindness, in her experience, has been rare and fragile, easily withdrawn. To rely on it feels reckless. Yet beneath this hardened exterior, fear persists, not as panic but as a steady pressure. It is the fear of miscalculation, of choosing wrongly in a world that no longer offers clear choices. She fears not only harm, but humiliation, the confirmation that her worth has indeed evaporated. This fear shapes her posture, her gaze, her silence. The war's final phase has stripped away illusions without replacing them. Peace has not yet arrived, but meaning has already collapsed. In this vacuum, she constructs a narrow moral universe in which restraint is virtue and expectation is sin. She believes that by wanting less, she can survive longer. This is the state in which the story finds her, not at a dramatic turning point, but at a point of near invisibility. She stands within history's margins, her suffering unrecorded, her fear unspoken. The war has not ended for her, because its most enduring weapon, deprivation, still governs her existence. And in this moment, before any intervention, before any reversal, she expects nothing but continuation. The pressure of hunger eventually narrows the field of choice until only one path remains. For days, she has resisted it, treating the idea of stepping forward as a failure of discipline rather than a necessity. Endurance, she tells herself, is still possible if she moves carefully enough, if she makes herself smaller in both body and expectation. But starvation is indifferent to pride. It advances steadily, eroding resolve with methodical patience, until refusal itself becomes a threat. The moment approaches without ceremony. There is no dramatic decision, no internal declaration of courage. Instead, it arrives as a quiet realization that her calculations no longer add up. The body's signals have grown insistent, less negotiable. Standing still makes her lightheaded. Walking requires pauses she did not need before. The effort of maintaining invisibility now costs more energy than she possesses. She understands, with a clarity that frightens her, that something must change even if change invites danger. Seeking help does not feel like an appeal, it feels like exposure. To step toward others is to surrender the last illusion of control she has maintained. Hunger, when hidden, can be framed as choice or stoicism. Hunger acknowledged becomes evidence. She fears that once seen, she will be defined entirely by her need, reduced to a problem rather than a person. This fear is not abstract. It has been reinforced by years in which vulnerability was met with exploitation, suspicion, or contempt. As she prepares herself, she rehearses silence. Words feel unreliable, capable of betraying her even if spoken carefully. Language has become a minefield, shaped by shifting authorities and unspoken rules. Saying too much invites interrogation. Saying too little can be interpreted as defiance. She decides that whatever happens, she will offer nothing unnecessary. Her posture will communicate submission without desperation. She will not plead. Pleading implies entitlement, and entitlement, she believes, is no longer permitted. The shame she carries intensifies as she moves closer to the moment. It settles into her chest with a physical weight heavier than hunger itself. She is ashamed not only of her condition, but of the fact that she has reached a point where she must reveal it. She feels she has failed an unspoken test of endurance, that others have suffered longer or more visibly without breaking. Comparison becomes another weapon turned inward, convincing her that her need is somehow illegitimate. Memory intrudes despite her efforts to suppress it. She recalls earlier months when asking for assistance still felt possible, when the world had not yet trained her to expect punishment in return. Those memories are not comforting, they sharpen the contrast. The gap between then and now feels like a personal descent, as though the war has not only changed circumstances but diminished her character. She knows this is not rational, but hunger does not respect reason. It distorts self-assessment until blame feels easier than uncertainty. As she approaches those who might help, fear reshapes itself. It is no longer diffuse or hypothetical. It becomes specific, attached to imagined outcomes. She pictures dismissal delivered with indifference, the casual cruelty of someone who has seen too much suffering to care about one more instance. She imagines being questioned, forced to account for herself, her past, her associations. She imagines the moment when help is withheld not because it is unavailable, but because she is deemed undeserving. The war has taught her that moral categories are applied retroactively and without consistency. People are judged not by what they need, but by what they represent. She worries that her hunger will not be interpreted as a human condition, but as a symbol of failure, complicity, or the wrong side of history. This fear freezes her briefly, causing her to hesitate just short of action. For a moment, she considers retreat, convincing herself that waiting a little longer might still be possible. But the body intervenes again. A wave of weakness passes through her, sudden enough to strip away illusion. She understands then that restraint has reached its limit. Continuing as she has is no longer neutral. It is a decision with consequences she may not survive. This realization does not feel like courage. It feels like resignation to necessity. Survival has narrowed her options until only risk remains. She steps forward with deliberate slowness, conscious of every movement. The world seems louder now, each sound amplified by her heightened awareness. Footsteps, distant voices, the rustle of fabric, all of it registers as potential threat. She keeps her gaze lowered, not out of submission alone, but to avoid reading expressions she is not prepared to interpret. Faces have become unpredictable instruments, capable of delivering judgment before a word is spoken. In this approach, she carries an expectation of humiliation that feels almost rehearsed. She braces herself to be looked at rather than addressed, assessed rather than acknowledged. The worst part of this anticipation is not the fear of physical harm, but the fear of moral exposure. She is prepared to be hungry. She is prepared to be frightened. What she dreads is being reduced, publicly and irrevocably, to someone whose suffering confirms a narrative she cannot escape. She tells herself that if rejection comes, she will accept it quietly. Dignity, she believes, now consists of not protesting the inevitable. This belief has been shaped by repeated lessons in futility. Protest rarely altered outcomes, it only intensified them. Silence, by contrast, sometimes allowed one to pass unnoticed. She clings to this strategy even as she violates its core principle by stepping into view. Her understanding of authority complicates the moment further. Uniforms no longer signify protection or order, they signify power exercised without intimacy. She has learned that those who hold authority often operate at a distance from individual consequence. Decisions are made efficiently, without room for exception. She fears becoming a data point, an inconvenience, or a risk to be managed rather than a person to be assisted. As the encounter draws closer, she becomes acutely aware of how she must appear. Her clothing hangs loosely, its wear amplified by her diminished frame. She knows that her physical state is obvious, impossible to disguise. This visibility feels like accusation, as though her body is presenting evidence she has not consented to submit. She resents this exposure even as she depends on it to justify her presence. The final steps feel unreal, as if she is watching herself from a distance. Hunger has thinned the boundary between action and observation. She notes details she might otherwise ignore: the texture of the ground beneath her feet, the way light catches on metal, the rhythm of her own breathing. These sensations anchor her in the present, preventing her from retreating fully into fear. She expects the moment of acknowledgement to be abrupt, perhaps even harsh. She has prepared herself for a command to stop, a gesture that signals dismissal. Her muscles are ready to tense, to withdraw. Even now, she does not imagine relief as a possible outcome. Relief would require a level of trust she no longer possesses. In this state, she carries with her the accumulated weight of war's moral erosion. She believes that compassion has been spent, that it was a finite resource exhausted by years of necessity and loss. If kindness still exists, she assumes it must be reserved for those whose suffering is clearer, whose innocence is beyond dispute. She does not include herself in that category. What she seeks, she tells herself, is minimal. Not restoration, not understanding, not absolution. Only enough to continue. Enough to quiet the body's alarm, to buy time. She has learned to frame her needs as temporary and undeserving, hoping this will make them easier to tolerate if they are denied. The moment before response stretches, heavy with anticipation. In that pause, her fear reaches its most concentrated form. It is the fear not just of rejection, but of confirmation, that the world she has adapted to, the one governed by suspicion and scarcity, is indeed the only one that remains. She stands ready to accept this outcome, even as something in her resists it. This is the threshold she crosses in this chapter, not between hunger and relief, but between isolation and exposure. Whatever follows, she knows she has already surrendered something irrevocable, the protective anonymity of silent suffering. And as she waits, braced for the worst, she believes with absolute certainty that nothing good comes from being seen in a world shaped by war. The encounter does not announce itself with force or spectacle. There is no sudden command, no sharp interruption that confirms her fears. Instead, it unfolds with a disarming lack of urgency, as if the world has briefly forgotten how to behave according to the rules she has come to expect. She registers movement first, then presence, then the subtle shift in attention that tells her she has been noticed. This sequence matters, because it is already different from what she anticipated. She had prepared herself for abruptness, for a response shaped by authority rather than awareness. What she encounters instead is something slower, more deliberate. The figures before her wear uniforms, but they do not immediately assert what those uniforms represent. There is no performance of dominance, no visible impatience. The men do not close distance aggressively, nor do they hold it with calculated detachment. They observe her, but the observation feels restrained, almost cautious, as if they are aware of the weight such attention carries. This restraint unsettles her more than hostility would have. She has learned how to endure cruelty. She has not learned how to interpret neutrality that leans toward care. Her body reacts before her mind can adjust. Muscles tense reflexively, breath shallow, prepared for escalation. She waits for the familiar pattern to assert itself, for the moment when restraint gives way to judgment. Seconds pass without that transformation. The delay creates space, and in that space, fear loses some of its certainty. It does not disappear, but it wavers, unsure of how to proceed without its usual cues. She notices that their gaze does not linger where she expects it to. They do not examine her with suspicion, scanning for signs of deception or guilt. Instead, their attention settles briefly on her condition, then moves on, as though they have already understood what needs to be understood. This shift is subtle but profound. For the first time in a long while, she is not required to explain herself. Her body speaks, and it is believed. The absence of interrogation disorients her. She has rehearsed responses, prepared to justify her presence, her hunger, her existence. None of that preparation is called upon. Questions do not come. Demands are not made. The silence is not punitive, it is practical. This distinction takes time to register. She remains still, uncertain whether movement might disrupt whatever fragile equilibrium has formed. When assistance is offered, it is done without ceremony. There is no announcement, no framing that emphasizes generosity or authority. The act itself is modest, almost understated, and that modesty is what gives it power. It does not seek to define her as a recipient of charity or as an object lesson in mercy. It is simply an acknowledgement of need, followed by response. Her first instinct is disbelief. She scans for conditions she may have missed, for expectations that will be revealed once she accepts. Years of scarcity have trained her to assume that nothing is given freely, that every gesture carries a hidden cost. She hesitates, not out of ingratitude, but out of survival instinct. Acceptance feels like exposure to a new kind of risk. The men do not press her. This, too, contradicts expectation. There is no insistence, no impatience with her hesitation. They allow the moment to proceed at her pace, as though aware that trust, once eroded, cannot be restored by force. This patience communicates something she has not felt in a long time: respect for her agency, however diminished her circumstances. As she accepts what is offered, the physical sensation grounds her in the present. The immediacy of relief is undeniable, yet it is accompanied by something more complex. The act of receiving does not bring the humiliation she had braced herself for. Instead, it brings confusion. The shame she expected to feel does not intensify. It loosens, its grip weakened by the absence of judgment. She becomes acutely aware of how small the moment is in scale. This is not rescue. It does not change the broader conditions of her life. It does not promise safety, stability, or future provision. And yet, its impact exceeds its material value. The simplicity of the act disrupts the narrative she has been living inside, the one that insists compassion is no longer operative in this world. What unsettles her most is not the kindness itself, but its neutrality. It is not framed as forgiveness, nor as reward. It does not require her to be innocent or deserving. It exists outside the moral accounting that has governed her existence for so long. This absence of moral framing is what allows the moment to reach her. Had it been presented as absolution or benevolence, she might have rejected it. Instead, it arrives as something almost administrative, as though care were still a functional part of reality. She notices that the men do not linger after the exchange. They do not watch her consume what has been given, do not seek confirmation of gratitude. Their attention moves elsewhere, back to tasks and surroundings. This withdrawal reinforces the impression that the act was not performed for effect. It was not meant to be remembered. It was meant to be done. This realization alters the emotional weight of the encounter. It shifts from something exceptional to something quietly normative. The idea that compassion could be routine, unremarkable, challenges her deepest assumptions. She has believed that kindness, if it exists at all, must be dramatic to justify itself. Here, it is almost invisible, and that invisibility makes it harder to dismiss. As the immediate tension drains from her body, she becomes aware of how much effort she has been expending simply to remain guarded. The release is not sudden, but incremental. Her shoulders lower slightly. Her breathing deepens. These changes are small, but they signal a shift she cannot fully articulate yet. For the first time in months, her body is not braced for impact. She does not reinterpret the war in this moment. The suffering remains real, the loss is intact. But the moral clarity she had constructed around cruelty begins to blur. She had believed that the war had revealed a final truth about human nature, one that favored indifference and punishment over understanding. This encounter introduces doubt into that conclusion. Doubt, she realizes, can be as disruptive as certainty. The memory of fear does not vanish. It lingers, a residue that will take time to fade. But it no longer feels absolute. It has been contradicted by experience, and that contradiction cannot be undone. Even if no further kindness follows, even if the world returns to its harsher patterns, this moment will remain as evidence that those patterns are not total. She becomes aware, perhaps for the first time, of how deeply she has internalized the war's logic. She has come to believe that suffering must always be justified, that need implies guilt. This belief has shaped her behavior so completely that its absence feels strange, almost destabilizing. Without the expectation of punishment, She is unsure how to orient herself. The encounter does not restore her sense of dignity in a dramatic way. There is no surge of empowerment, no sudden clarity. Instead, dignity returns quietly, as the absence of its denial. She is treated as someone whose condition warrants response, not evaluation. This simple recognition has a cumulative effect, restoring something she did not realize had been lost. As the moment concludes, she is left with a complex mixture of relief and unease. Relief, because her immediate need has been acknowledged. Unease, because the encounter has disrupted her understanding of how the world operates. She has relied on predictability, even when that predictability was grim. Kindness introduces uncertainty of a different kind. She moves away carrying more than she arrived with. The physical relief is temporary, but the psychological impact persists. She replays the moment not for its details, but for its tone. The absence of cruelty stands out more vividly than any act of aggression ever has. It challenges her to reconsider the boundaries she has drawn around possibility. This is not a turning point marked by decision or declaration. It is quieter, more insidious. A single interaction has introduced a fracture into the narrative of inevitability she has been living by. She does not yet know what that fracture will become. She only knows that something has shifted, and that the certainty of the worst, which once governed her every step, has been irrevocably weakened. In the space left behind by fear's retreat, even if only partially, something unfamiliar begins to form. It is not hope in its conventional sense. It is more restrained, more cautious. It is the recognition that the moral landscape of the war is not as uniformly barren as she believed. And that recognition, once made, cannot be unmade. The immediate moment passes, but its effects do not resolve themselves neatly. She walks away carrying a strange imbalance within her, as though something fundamental has shifted without settling into place. The fear that once dominated her movements has loosened, yet it has not disappeared. It lingers in the background, uncertain now, deprived of its former authority. What replaces it is not confidence, but a quiet disorientation. She no longer knows exactly what rules govern the world she is moving through. Shame, which had once felt inseparable from hunger, begins to behave differently. It does not vanish, but it no longer sharpens with each step. Instead, it dulls, losing its edge as the logic that sustained it weakens. She realizes that much of her shame was not born from her circumstances alone, but from the belief that those circumstances reflected something essential about her worth. The encounter has not disproved that belief outright, but it has disrupted its certainty. Doubt enters where there was once only acceptance. Her body responds more quickly than her thoughts. With the immediate crisis eased, tension drains in small increments. She notices this only in retrospect, when she realizes she is no longer scanning every face for threat, no longer calculating exits with the same urgency. This easing feels unfamiliar, even unsafe, as though vigilance itself were a form of protection she is reluctant to abandon. Letting go, even partially, feels like exposure. She becomes aware of how deeply she has been living in reaction rather than intention. Hunger and fear have dictated her rhythms for so long that the absence of their dominance leaves a void. Into that void comes reflection, uninvited and unstructured. She begins to replay the encounter, not obsessively, but with a slow curiosity. She searches it for hidden meanings, for signs she may have misunderstood. Each replay yields the same result: no accusation, no demand, no moral verdict. This realization unsettles her more than any overt cruelty could have. She has grown accustomed to interpreting every interaction through a framework of judgment and consequence. Without that framework, she feels momentarily unmoored. The war has taught her to read danger into neutrality, to assume that silence conceals intent. Now, silence has concealed only restraint, and she does not yet know how to integrate that into her understanding of the world. As time passes, the encounter begins to exert a quiet pressure on her internal narratives. She has told herself, repeatedly and convincingly, that suffering is the natural state of those who endure defeat, that deprivation is both punishment and proof. These stories have helped her make sense of chaos by assigning it moral structure. The encounter does not negate the chaos, but it refuses to reinforce the structure she has relied upon. This refusal feels like a challenge she did not choose. She notices subtle changes in how she moves through space. Where she once hugged the edges of rooms and streets, she now occupies space a fraction more openly. The difference is slight, almost imperceptible to others, but significant to her. It is not confidence, but permission, a tentative allowance she grants herself without fully understanding why. She tests this permission cautiously, ready to withdraw it at the first sign of threat. Memory begins to resurface in unexpected ways. Not the distant memories of life before the war, but smaller recollections of moments when kindness existed without announcement. These memories had been buried under layers of more recent experience, dismissed as anomalies or illusions. Now, they return with renewed relevance, suggesting that the encounter was not an exception, but part of a pattern she had been forced to forget. She struggles with this idea, resisting it instinctively. To accept that compassion still operates in the world is to accept the risk of disappointment. Hope, even in its mildest form, carries the possibility of loss. She has learned to protect herself by expecting nothing. The encounter tempts her to revise that strategy, but she does not do so willingly. She tests the idea cautiously, examining it from a distance rather than embracing it. Her understanding of dignity begins to shift. Previously, dignity meant endurance without visibility, suffering borne silently to avoid further harm. Now, she considers the possibility that dignity might also include being seen without being diminished. This possibility feels radical, even dangerous. It contradicts years of learned behavior. She is not sure she believes it, but she cannot entirely dismiss it either. She becomes more aware of the cost of her previous certainty. Believing the worst had provided stability, but it had also demanded constant vigilance and emotional suppression. The easing of that vigilance reveals fatigue she had not acknowledged. She realizes how much energy she has spent maintaining a worldview that left no room for mercy. The encounter exposes that effort, making its burden visible for the first time. As days pass, she notices that her internal language begins to change. Where she once framed her survival in terms of avoidance and restraint, she now occasionally allows herself to think in terms of continuation. This shift is subtle and inconsistent, but it marks a departure from pure endurance. Continuation implies a future, however undefined, and that implication feels both hopeful and threatening. She does not romanticize what has happened. Hunger still returns. Fear still asserts itself in moments of uncertainty. The war has not softened its grip on the world around her. Yet something has altered in how she relates to these realities. They no longer feel like verdicts handed down by an unchangeable order. They feel contingent, subject to interruption. The men she encountered do not become symbols in her mind. She resists elevating them into representations of goodness or redemption. Doing so would distance the encounter from reality, turning it into something exceptional rather than instructive. Instead, she remembers them as ordinary, defined more by what they did not do than by what they did. This ordinariness is what gives the memory its weight. She begins to recognize how thoroughly she has internalized the war's dehumanization. Not only has she been treated as expendable, she has come to see herself that way. The encounter exposes this internalization by contradicting it without argument. No one tells her she matters, they simply act as though she does. This implicit recognition bypasses her defenses, reaching a part of her that words would not. There is a period of resistance that follows. She catches herself dismissing the encounter as luck, as anomaly, as a brief lapse in an otherwise indifferent system. This dismissal is comforting because it preserves her existing worldview. Yet it requires effort to maintain. Each time she revisits the memory, the simplicity of the act undermines her attempts to contain it. There was no spectacle, no incentive, no visible reason for restraint. She notices changes in how she perceives others as well. Faces that once blurred into potential threats now appear more differentiated. She becomes more attentive to small gestures, to moments of hesitation or restraint that might indicate something other than hostility. This attentiveness does not make her trusting, but it makes her less closed. She begins to recognize variability where she once saw only danger. The encounter also forces her to reconsider her relationship to guilt. She has carried an unexamined sense of collective responsibility, absorbing blame without knowing how to locate it. The act of compassion does not absolve her, but it questions the premise that absolution is required for survival. She begins to entertain the possibility that living does not require constant justification. This shift brings with it a new kind of discomfort. If suffering is not always deserved, then the narrative that made it bearable begins to unravel. She must confront the randomness of harm, the fact that deprivation does not always correspond to moral failure. This randomness is frightening because it offers no rules to follow, no strategies to guarantee safety. Yet it is also liberating because it loosens the grip of self-blame. She moves through this period without resolution. There is no clear conclusion, no moment when she declares herself changed. The war has taught her to distrust sudden transformations. Instead, change arrives as a gradual reorientation, uneven and reversible. Some days, fear reasserts itself with full force, and the encounter feels distant, almost unreal. On other days, its influence surfaces unexpectedly, shaping her reactions in subtle ways. What remains constant is the knowledge that her expectations were proven incomplete. The certainty of the worst, which once structured her entire existence, has been interrupted. This interruption does not erase the past, but it alters how the past informs the present. She carries this alteration quietly, without announcing it even to herself. In this chapter of her experience, nothing dramatic occurs. There is no outward transformation, no visible sign that anything has changed. Yet beneath the surface, a recalibration is underway. The war's moral simplicity, its insistence on winners and losers, guilt and innocence, has been complicated by a single act of restraint. That complication does not resolve her suffering, but it changes its meaning. She continues forward with this unresolved tension, aware now that her internal world is no longer aligned entirely with the external one. Compassion has not saved her, but it has unsettled her despair. And in that unsettled space, something begins to take shape, not hope as a promise, but dignity as a possibility. Time stretches forward, and the encounter settles into her life not as a climax but as a quiet undercurrent. It does not demand attention every day, nor does it fade into irrelevance. Instead, it resurfaces intermittently, often when she least expects it, shaping her reactions in subtle ways. The memory becomes less about what happened and more about what it made possible to imagine. It exists alongside hunger, fatigue, and uncertainty, not replacing them, but altering how they are carried. She begins to recognize that the moment did not rescue her from circumstance. Her life remains constrained by scarcity, by the lingering instability of a world recovering unevenly from devastation. Yet the encounter has altered the internal scale by which she measures endurance. Survival no longer feels like an entirely solitary endeavor. Even when no help is visible, the knowledge that help once appeared without warning complicates her sense of isolation. She is still alone, but not absolutely so. This realization reshapes how she understands resilience. Previously, resilience meant withstanding harm without expectation of relief, absorbing hardship as proof of discipline. Now, resilience begins to include receptivity, the ability to recognize assistance when it arrives and to accept it without collapsing into shame. This form of resilience feels unfamiliar and fragile, but it also feels more humane. It allows for vulnerability without surrender. She notices that her relationship to others shifts incrementally. Where she once avoided all interaction beyond necessity, she now tolerates brief exchanges without the same reflexive withdrawal. She listens more carefully, observes more patiently. These changes are not acts of trust, but they signal a loosening of the defensive posture that once defined her movements. The world remains dangerous, but it is no longer uniformly hostile. The encounter also reframes her understanding of power. She had believed power expressed itself primarily through domination and control, that authority inevitably translated into coercion. The restraint she witnessed complicates that belief. It suggests that power can also manifest as choice. The choice not to humiliate, not to punish, not to exploit vulnerability. This realization unsettles her assumptions about hierarchy and agency, introducing nuance where she once saw inevitability. She does not idealize the men involved. They do not become heroes in her memory, nor symbols of moral clarity. To do so would distance the experience from reality, turning it into a story rather than a reference. Instead, they remain ordinary figures who acted without spectacle. Their ordinariness reinforces the idea that compassion does not require exceptional virtue. It can exist within routine, exercised quietly and without recognition. This understanding carries weight as she navigates future moments of need. She becomes more attentive to her own thresholds, more honest with herself about when endurance becomes self-erasure. While she does not seek help readily, she no longer dismisses the possibility outright. The internal prohibition against asking begins to weaken, replaced by a more complex calculation that includes the potential for dignity rather than its guaranteed loss. She reflects, sometimes with discomfort, on how thoroughly she had absorbed the war's moral judgments. She had come to believe that suffering was a kind of sentence, imposed for reasons that must exist even if they were not visible. The encounter challenges this belief by offering relief without explanation. It suggests that suffering can be arbitrary, and that relief does not always follow moral logic. This arbitrariness is unsettling, but it also removes the burden of self-condemnation. As she continues forward, she becomes aware of how memory itself functions as a form of sustenance. In moments of acute despair, she recalls the tone of the interaction rather than its specifics. The calm, the absence of threat, the refusal to escalate. These elements form a counterweight to fear, reminding her that not every encounter must end in harm. This reminder does not eliminate fear, but it tempers its authority.